Hello, my name is Mike Bell, and this video introduces the new book from Routledge, The Fundamentals of Teaching. That is, it creates a 5-step model for you to put the research evidence into practice. So we all want to improve the learning of our students, but what should we do? Teachers are bombarded with advice. We get government initiatives, we get blogs, colleagues give us advice, we read books, there are Twitter feeds, gurus and newspapers all telling teachers what they should do. The question is, how can we decide what will be most effective in improving the learning of our students and perhaps at the same time reducing our own stress? There is some really good news. Among those people who focus on the evidence about teaching, there is broad general agreement, and that's what I hope to show in this short video and which we demonstrate in the book. So we now know how learning happens, why some students struggle, and how to improve the learning of all students. But we also know how to get better results for our students with no extra effort on our part, which has to be good news. So what's the best way to make the evidence accessible to teachers? Because of course it exists in thousands of different research papers. So we asked 1,000 teachers if they'd prefer access to thousands of research papers online so they could read the research evidence for themselves and make their own decisions, or 12 books which covered different parts of the evidence in quite a lot of detail, or one book which summarised the main findings and explained how to apply them. Well, over 75% of teachers said that they would prefer one summary, and that's what we hope we've produced here in the Fundamentals of Teaching. We create a 5-step learning process: prior knowledge, presentation, challenge, feedback and repetition. But how do we know that this is what the evidence shows? Well, there are 3 main sources of evidence available on learning. Firstly, from classroom experiments, where a method has been tried out in a classroom and compared with another control group, a classroom using a traditional method for the same subject. If we do that, we can get some reliable data. If we do it dozens of times, if different teachers do it, if different researchers do it, then we can end up with some reliable results. Second source of evidence is educational psychology. Again, they do experiments, but these often start off in a lab, for instance with volunteers working at a computer, so that they can work out which are the best ways to improve retention and long-term memory. And thirdly, we now have some evidence from neuroscience, that is from brain science, which tells us how learning happens. Now, if we were to find the area in between where all 3 of these sources of evidence agree, we might be able to call that evidence-based teaching. That is, it would have so much evidence for it, we could be particularly confident that we can use that method with and that it will improve the learning of our students. The really good news is that these 3 areas more or less overlap at the moment, and so the area of evidence-based teaching is huge. So the first source of evidence, as I said, was classroom-based evidence, and the first source which we used is this well-known book by John Hattie, Visible Learning. In fact, the later version, Visible Learning for Teachers. And they've looked at over 100 different ways to improve the learning in the classroom. Not all of them classroom-based methods. Second source is this book by Marzano and Dean, where they looked at high-quality research just about the classroom and came up with 10 highly effective methods. And the third source is the Education Endowment Foundation and their Teaching and Learning Toolkit. They've taken another look at fundamental research and they rank the effectiveness in terms of months impact. They also tell you the strength of the evidence and the cost per pupil, which allows you to decide which are the most cost-effective and time-effective ways to improve the learning of your students. Now, when we look at those three lists initially, and we've only taken in Hattie's list those methods which are classroom based, the lists do not initially appear to be the same. However, when we start to look a little closer, we do see the same things in columns. So feedback in 3, for instance. And sometimes we see things that are the same when you look at the detail, but are actually called something different. So in Hattie's list it's called spaced practice. In Marzano's list it's called repetition. And in the EEF list it's called secondary homework. When you actually look at the details, they're all roughly saying the same thing. Then we've got metacognition here, problem solving, sometimes called hypothesis testing, phonics, cooperative or collaborative learning, etc., etc. So when we look in detail, there is a high level of agreement. And we can summarize this in a 5-step learning cycle, because as you will see on the list, it doesn't tell you when to use them. So here is the 5-step cycle shown in 2 ways. On the left we can see first of all you assess your students' prior knowledge. Number 2, you present information to them. Well, you do that anyway, but here are some methods which work better than others. Then you need to set a challenging task. You need to provide feedback to your students so they can make an improvement, and then they need some sort of spaced repetition in order to form long-term memories. And finally, you may assess your students to see that they have learnt sufficiently for you to go on to the next stage. That is, the assessment of one level is going to be the prior knowledge test for the next. So that gives you the classroom-based evidence. Now let's look at 2 major sources of educational psychology research. Again, hundreds of different pieces of research have been done, and every now and again a group of academics come together to do what is called a research review, that is, bringing all the research together and finding the main conclusions. And in this publication by Barak Rosenstein, Principles of Instruction, you'll see that he comes up with 10 principles. And if you were to pause the video and compare it with the other list, you'll see that these are not different from the ones which we get from the classroom evidence. Second source of evidence, similar thing, different people, National Centre for Educational Research. They produced 7 principles, again analysing the evidence from educational psychology. If we put all these 5 together on a table and sort them in the order in which you might use them in the classroom, starting off with prior knowledge and going through presenting new material, etc., you can see that there are ticks in many boxes, and we have only chosen those methods which appear in more than one column, or if they only appear once in this table, they are strongly endorsed by the educational neuroscience, which we touch on in a minute. So for instance, we only see one tick in the box called working memory limit, but that is so securely supported by the educational neuroscience that we've included it in the list. So finally we get to the educational neuroscience. I don't attempt to do much about that in this video. In the book we present an easy to learn and apply model based on the evidence with easy to understand diagram. So what is in the book, The Fundamentals of Teaching? So it's in 3 sections. The first section is called Evidence, and we have 3 chapters. Firstly, getting reliable evidence. If you're familiar with research reviews and measuring effect size, so that we can compare one method with another, then perhaps you don't need to read that chapter, but it is important to understand that finding reliable evidence is not easy. Chapter 2 covers the sources of evidence, that is the 3 sources which I've outlined just now, and how we created the 5 steps and what the effective methods list is. And third chapter is on brain-based explanations. This is a major breakthrough because we can explain using educational neuroscience and using simple to follow diagrams the process which is happening in the brain when your students form long-term memories. and we can use this as an explanation for why the effective methods work. So when you use this section, you use it to improve your understanding of the learning process. Section 2, Effective Classroom Practice, takes you through those 5 steps. So checking and repairing prior knowledge, effective ways to present new information, how to set a challenging task to promote the learning process, ways to provide feedback for improvement so that the correct memories are formed, and finally ways to offer spaced repetition to ensure that long-term memories are formed. You will see in the chapter on the neuroscience that without spaced repetition, long-term memories cannot be formed. So each method contains a prior knowledge quiz for you. That is, before you read the chapter, just do the quiz to check that you don't have prior knowledge missing, which will help you understand why this method is so successful. Then we look at case studies, real teachers telling us how they've used this method. We have a brain-based explanation for each of the methods, which builds on the basic information in chapter 3. We ask when you should use this method, whether you should use it in every class or just occasionally. And finally, we give you some further reading. That is, we identify chapters in 2 or 3 other books which cover this particular method. So when you're using section 3, you use the knowledge of the learning process from section 1 to analyze the learning in your classroom and choose methods which meet a learning need. It's quite important that you don't use a method simply because it's on the list. For instance, if the problem in your classroom is lack of prior knowledge, then extra feedback may help a little, but it won't help anything like as much as addressing the prior knowledge. In section 3, we look at using school and college resources effectively. That is, we identify time-consuming but ineffective methods and so give you the chance to reduce your workload. Getting the most benefit from staff development so we don't waste those training days and the money spent on them. The most effective use of teaching assistants. The best ways to use technology to improve learning. And finally, we identify some myths and low-effect methods. So using section 3, you audit the way your school or college currently uses these resources and plan changes to improve cost effectiveness. If you'd like to buy this book, it costs around about £15 UK. In Amazon, simply search Bell Fundamentals Teaching. If you want to buy it direct from Routledge, look on routledge.com and search Fundamentals of Teaching, or if you just put Routledge Bell Fundamentals into a search engine, you should find it that way as well. And if you use the promo code ACD21, you should get at least a 20% discount. My name is Mike Bell. I'm from the Evidence-Based Teachers Network. This is our website. Thank you for watching.